October 15, 1942. Dayton, Ohio. Inside a small, noisy workshop, an engineer wipes oil from his hands and looks down at his sketch, a strange, ugly little gun made mostly from car parts. The generals laughed at it. The soldiers didn't want it. It looked like junk. But that junk would soon become one of the most reliable weapons in American history, a $20 gun that could save a man's life when everything else failed. While fancy guns jammed in the mud, this one kept firing. While others shined on parade grounds, this one fought through rain, dust, and blood. No one believed it would work until it changed the war. So stay with us till the end to discover how one simple, cheap weapon quietly rewrote history. If you love powerful, true stories from World War II, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and support us. It helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to life. This is the story of how one engineer's $20 gun became America's most reliable weapon. October 1942. America was in the middle of World War II. Factories ran day and night. Every hour, more soldiers were being trained. And every soldier needed a gun. But there was one big problem. The standard American submachine gun, the Thompson, was beautiful, reliable, and far too expensive. Each one cost about $200, the same as 4 months of a private's pay. That meant the US could not make enough for the millions of men fighting overseas. "We can't afford to win this way," one officer said in frustration. The numbers were simple but frightening. Even if the army had unlimited steel, it didn't have the time or money to build enough Thompsons to arm everyone. Factories in Detroit and Dayton were already making tanks, jeeps, and engines. Skilled machinists were stretched thin. Each Thompson required dozens of hours of precise metal cutting and polishing. It was a masterpiece, but a masterpiece built for peace, not for a world at war. The smell of hot oil filled the air at the General Motors Inland Division in Dayton, Ohio. Machines hammered out engine parts and aircraft frames. But at one workbench, an engineer named George Hyde sat with his slide rule and blueprints, staring at an impossible equation. He had been told to design a gun that could do the job of a Thompson, but at 1/10 the price. No one thought it could be done. "It can't work," a fellow engineer muttered. "You can't make a good gun out of pressed steel." To most of them, guns were supposed to be made the old way, from solid blocks of machined steel, polished until they gleamed. But America didn't have time for perfection anymore. It needed a weapon that could be built fast, built cheap, and still save lives. The War Department SEP's reports were urgent. By early 1943, new divisions would be heading overseas, thousands of men, and most would have no submachine guns at all. A memo from Washington put it simply: existing supply cannot meet projected demand. This was not a design challenge. It was a national emergency. The paradox was painful. The most admired gun in the American arsenal was also the one that could lose the war. Every Thompson that rolled off the line was a triumph of craftsmanship and a symbol of inefficiency. In the dark corners of the factory, workers joked that the Thompson fires bullets and dollars at the same rate. Outside, winter wind rattled the high windows. Inside, George Hyde began sketching. He didn't care about curves or polish. He cared about what would keep a soldier alive in the mud. That night, as the factory floor emptied and the noise faded, Hyde looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. He picked up a piece of scrap metal, dull, unshaped, ordinary, and ran his hand across it. He whispered, "Maybe this is what victory will look like, not beautiful but strong." The war machine demanded speed. The old ways were too slow. And so, in a quiet corner of Dayton, one engineer began to imagine a new kind of gun, a $20 weapon that could do the work of a $200 one. He didn't know it yet, but what he would build would change how America made weapons forever. But before he could start, he needed orders, and they were coming fast. This was only the beginning. A few days later, a dark green army car stopped in front of the General Motors plant. Out stepped Colonel René Studler, the man in charge of the Army's small arms program. He carried a single folder, thin, but heavy with pressure. Inside it was a list of demands that read almost like a joke. A new submachine gun must. Fire the same .45 ACP bullets as the Thompson. Cost no more than $20. They're made mostly from stamped and welded steel. Be simple enough for factory workers, not gunsmiths, and be ready for production in 7 months. Studler looked at Hyde and said, "If you can do this, you shall save lives. If you fail, thousands will die without a weapon." It wasn't a design request. It was an order born from desperation. Hyde read the paper twice. 7 months. He thought of all the steps, the design, the blueprints, the testing, the factory changes. Normally, such a task would take 2 years. He had just over 200 days. He sighed, adjusted his glasses, and nodded. "We still find a way." At night, the engineers gathered in the small drafting room. The air smelled of coffee and burning metal from the factory floor below. A radio hummed news from the Pacific, Guadalcanal, heavy losses, jungle fighting. The team fell silent. They all knew what that meant, more soldiers needing better guns. The next morning, Hyde's small team began sketching ideas. The first rule, no machining unless absolutely necessary. Everything should be pressed, welded, or riveted, just like car parts. "We stir not building art," Hyde told his assistant, Frederick Sampson. "We stir building survival." Sampson nodded. He was younger, with oil-stained hands and a mechanic's instincts. He had spent years working with automobile stamping machines. He knew what they could do. The plan was bold. Instead of carving a gun from solid metal, they would press 2 halves of steel and weld them together like a clamshell. It would be lighter, cheaper, faster, and to most gun experts completely wrong. When Hyde shared the early drawings with a visiting officer, the man laughed. "This looks like a muffler, not a weapon," he said. Hyde smiled quietly. "Then maybe it'll survive the battlefield." The paradox was growing clearer every day. The uglier the gun looked, the better it might work. Still, pressure mounted. Colonel Studler visited again and again, asking for updates. The clock was ticking. 7 months meant everything had to go right the first time. No mistakes, no redesigns. Every night, the factory echoed with the clatter of presses testing new shapes of steel. Sparks flew. Tools cracked. Welds broke. The workers cursed, then started over. One machinist later remembered, "We didn't think this thing would ever shoot. It looked too simple, too light." But Hyde never gave up. By the start of December, the first prototype was ready. It looked rough, like a piece of plumbing pipe with a barrel attached. Hyde named it the T-15. He wrapped it in brown paper, marked it for delivery to Aberdeen Proving Ground, and sent it off for testing. He knew what the experts would say, but he hoped the results would speak louder than appearances. Outside, snow began to fall over Dayton. Inside, the machines kept hammering. The gun that could change the war was on its way, and its biggest challenge was about to begin. But what came next would test more than steel. January 1943. The wind cut across the frozen fields of Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Soldiers in heavy coats watched as crates were unloaded from a muddy army truck. Inside one box lay George Hyde's T-15, wrapped in oil paper and hope. To the men who opened it, the sight was almost funny. The gun was short, plain, and boxy. No wood finish, no shine, no polish. One officer frowned and said, "Looks like something that fell off a Buick assembly line." Another laughed, "You call this a weapon?" The test officer wrote in his notes, "Rough, awkward, industrial in appearance." It was exactly the reaction Hyde expected and feared. But looks weren't the goal. Performance was. The T-15 was made from stamped sheet steel, welded together in hours, not days. The entire receiver cost less than $3 to make, compared to $15 for the Thompsons. Still, the testers didn't care about cost. They cared about accuracy and reliability. The T-15 fired well enough, but it jammed after 50 rounds. The weld seams cracked. The stock bent. A report was sent back, unacceptable for field service. The project was close to death before it had even begun. When Hyde read the report, he stayed quiet for a long time. Sampson spoke first. "Maybe they sips right," he said. "Maybe it sips too cheap to last." Hyde shook his head. "No. We built the right idea. just not the right version. He walked to the window. Outside, the factory smoke curled into the grey winter sky. They laughed at it because it doesn't set look like a gun, he said softly. But beauty doesn't set win wars. Back at the plant, they started again. Hyde took every weakness and turned it into a challenge. The stock needed strength, so they added thicker tubing. The receiver needed better welds. They refined the press molds. The bolt needed weight. They built it heavier and slower, reducing the rate of fire to make it easier to control. Each change made the gun simpler, sturdier, and more suited for dirty, wet battlefields. At night, Hyde walked the plant floor, watching sparks fly as welders worked. The air smelled of hot steel and smoke. Machines pounded like thunder. In the noise, he saw the future. A weapon born not from gunmakers, but from car builders. A worker once remembered, "He told us not to polish the parts, said soldiers didn't care if it shined, only if it fired." The paradox grew stronger. Every time the army rejected his design for being too ugly, he made it even simpler. By February, the second version was ready, the T-20. It looked even plainer than before, just a smooth tube, a simple trigger, a folding wire stock, but this time, it worked. When the T-20 was tested, it fired hundreds of rounds without a single jam. Soldiers who tried it called it strange but steady. Still, some officers laughed. "This is what we come to," one said. "A grease gun." The nickname stuck. The grease gun. It was meant as an insult, but it would become a badge of honor. The T-15 had failed, but the failure was the foundation. Now George Hyde knew exactly what he had to build. A gun so simple that even mud and snow couldn't stop it. And in a war of factories, that simplicity might just win. The next tests would prove it. After Aberdeen's harsh judgment, George Hyde did not give up. He listened. He watched. He learned. The rejection did not slow him. It sharpened him. In the cold light of the Dayton plant, he and Frederick Sampson began to cut away everything that was not needed. Where the Thompson kept parts for looks, they kept parts for life. Where tradition wanted polished steel and fitted wood, they chose stamped plates and strong welds. The change felt almost cruel to old ideas. Soldiers were used to guns that looked like tools of pride. Now Hyde wanted something that looked like a tool from an auto shop. It was a hard choice. Make weapons that pleased pride, or make weapons that kept people alive. That simple difference would shape every decision they made. Sampson walked the stamping presses and thought like a car maker, not a gunsmith. "We can stamp a receiver in seconds," he told Hyde. "Why spend hours on a block of steel?" His voice carried over the steady beat of presses, a rhythm like a giant heart driving the factory. The air smelled of hot metal, grease, and coolant. Sparks flew when dies closed. It felt noisy and alive. The new idea used two pressed halves for the receiver. Each half was a thin shell of steel. They fit together and welded along the edges. This clamshell method cut cost and time. Where a Thompson receiver might cost about $15 to machine, the pressed receiver could be made for around $2.50. That number was simple, brutal proof. A finished gun could cost near $20, not $200. For men trying to arm millions, this was more than math, it was hope. Another big change was the enclosed action. The Thompson had many moving parts exposed to dirt and sand. The new gun would hide its bolt and springs inside the receiver. Dirt could not get in as easily. Water and mud would not jam the mechanism so fast. It was a small idea that meant a lot in jungles, deserts, and frozen fields. The enclosed action became the gun's shield. Hyde also changed the bolt. He made it heavier and let it move more slowly. The Thompson ran at more than 700 rounds per minute. Hyde's design ran near 450 rounds per minute. Slower speed meant fewer wasted bullets and better control for soldiers firing in bursts. One sergeant later wrote, "I could actually keep my aim. The Thompson made me spray, this made me hit." That simple line came from a man who had tried both guns under fire. The stock was different too. No carved walnut, no heavy wood. Instead, a thin wire stock folded against the gun. It saved space inside tanks and in trucks. It weighed less. It did not break when tossed around. When a paratrooper squeezed it into a jump bag, he felt relief. He felt lighter. The smell of oil on the wire was less important than the feel of a gun that fit where others could not. Hyde also added a dust cover safety. Flip it open to fire, shut it to safe. It was not pretty. It was simple and hard to fail. In cold or mud, a small, complex safety could freeze or clog. The dust cover did not. It worked when hands were numb and fast. Every change seemed to anger the old guard. They called it crude. They feared soldiers would lose confidence. But the math was hard to argue. Stamped parts, cheaper steel, less machining. These meant thousands more guns. Hyde and Sampson argued that a soldier who trusted his weapon mattered more than a weapon that looked fine in peacetime parades. A toolmaker from the factory later said, "We weren't making guns like before, we were making something that could be made a lot, fast. That's what the army needed." His fingers still smelled of grease as he said it. This was the pivot. The team turned from making art to making life-saving tools. Ugly became practical, simple became strong. The design moved from paper to hard metal, ready for real tests. What they had built needed one thing: proof. Tests at Aberdeen and in the field would decide if practicality could beat prestige. Winter 1943, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The wind was sharp and cold, and the ground was covered with frozen mud. Soldiers and engineers stood around long wooden tables filled with new weapons, the grease gun among them. Some men laughed when they saw it. "Looks like a plumber made it," one officer said. But George Hyde stood silent. He knew this was the moment that would decide whether his strange, cheap-looking gun would live or die. The Thompson submachine gun stood beside it, polished, heavy, beautiful. Its wood gleamed even in the grey morning light. The grease gun looked dull, flat, almost like junk, but the tests would not care about looks. They would care about one thing only: could it fire when everything else failed? The test began with the mud test. Both guns were coated in thick, wet earth. The air smelled like clay and oil. Soldiers worked their fingers numb as they loaded magazines. The first Thompson fired 6 rounds, then jammed. A chunk of mud had blocked the bolt. The grease gun was next. It fired all 30 rounds in slow, even rhythm. No jams, no smoke, just the steady pop-pop-pop of a weapon doing its job. Then came the sand test. Dry sand was poured into every opening. The Thompson jammed after just a few seconds again. The grease gun coughed once, then kept firing. Its simple, closed bolt design had done what the fancy machining could not. It kept the dirt out. One of the observers, a sergeant from North Africa, said quietly, "That thing's ugly, but it'll fight." The engineers wrote down the numbers. The Thompson had 12 stoppages per 1,000 rounds. The grease gun had less than 2. Those numbers told the story more clearly than any speech. Reliability had a new name, and it wasn't Thompson. They moved on to cold weather tests. In the freezing chamber, oil turned to jelly. Many guns froze solid. The grease gun sipped thick spring and simple design worked even with stiffened grease. One mechanic said, "You could probably drop it in a snowbank, kick it out, and it'd sit still shoot." The final test was speed and accuracy. Soldiers fired in bursts at 25 and 50 yards. The Thompson had higher fire rate, about 700 rounds per minute, but most bullets went wide. The grease gun fired slower, around 450 rounds per minute, and stayed on target. Fewer bullets, more hits. For soldiers with limited ammo, that mattered. After the tests, the officers walked in silence. Colonel Studler spoke first. "It isn't handsome," he said, "but it works." His words carried weight. In the Army's world, function now beat fashion. The cheap gun had beaten the champion. Hyde didn't celebrate. He simply nodded and said, "It's meant for the man who has to trust it, not admire it." He knew what was next. If the Army approved it, production would begin immediately. The factory men in Indiana were waiting for the signal. But even as reports praised the new weapon, some officers pushed back. "It's not fit for the image of our army," one said in a meeting. They feared that showing such a plain, ugly gun would look weak, especially compared to the Germans' sleek MP-40. Yet in the field, Soldiers cared only about survival. As one infantryman later said, "I don't care what it looks like, I care if it shoots when it's wet." That was the paradox of war industry. The men fighting needed simplicity. The men commanding wanted prestige. But reality won again. The numbers were too strong. By spring 1943, the grease gun had earned its name and its place. The Army officially adopted it as the M3 submachine gun. The paperwork was signed, the stamps approved, and the new weapon's future handed to General Motors' Guide Lamp Division in Anderson, Indiana. The tests were over. The design had survived fire, ice, and pride. But the next challenge would be even bigger. Could America's factories build it fast enough to arm a world at war? The answer would prove that America's real weapon wasn't beauty or money, it was mass production. Spring 1943, Anderson, Indiana. The war was hungry for weapons, and the new M3 submachine gun was ready to feed that hunger. At the Guide Lamp Division of General Motors, the sound of industry filled the air. Machines hammered, metal clanged, and the smell of hot oil and steel drifted through the huge factory halls. Thousands of workers, men and women both, stood shoulder to shoulder, turning flat sheets of steel into the weapon that would soon be called the $20 gun that won the war. This was a new kind of war-making. Instead of skilled gunsmiths filing and polishing, there were factory workers pressing and welding. Each part of the M3 was designed to be built quickly and cheaply. One worker could stamp a receiver in less than 30 seconds. Another could weld the two halves together in under a minute. Every movement was part of a rhythm, like music made of iron and fire. The old Thompson needed over 250 separate machining steps to complete. The M3, only 75 steps. The difference was enormous. It meant that where one factory could make about 50 Thompsons a day, Guide Lamp could produce more than 1,000 M3 SEP daily once at full speed. That was not just progress. It was a revolution in how America built its weapons. Each Male 3 cost about $20 to produce, compared to the Thompson's $200. The Army's accountants couldn't believe it at first. For every Thompson they could buy, they could now get 10 M3 Serve. This meant more guns for tank crews, for paratroopers, for engineers, for anyone who needed firepower. It was like turning money directly into survival. But building a weapon this way was not easy. The workers were not all trained machinists. Many were housewives, farm boys, or high school graduates new to factory life. Posters on the walls read, "Every weld wins a war." Women in blue coveralls wiped sweat from their faces as sparks flew. They called themselves the Grease Girls, proud that their hands helped build something soldiers trusted. One worker later said, "It wasn't set pretty work, but we knew it mattered. Every gun we made meant someone set son came home." Her voice shook when she remembered the sound of the presses. You couldn't hear yourself think, but you could feel the purpose. The factory moved like a living creature. Steel sheets entered one end, finished weapons rolled out the other. Inspectors checked every weld, every spring. They tested random samples, firing them on the range behind the plant. The air smelled of gunpowder and oil. Out of every 100 guns, only 1 or 2 failed inspection, an incredible success rate for wartime speed. Guide Lamp's success also changed minds in Washington. Before the M3, many believed only small arms companies like Colt or Winchester could make reliable weapons. Now an automotive parts division was building one of the most trusted submachine guns in history. America had learned that cars and guns shared the same heartbeat, mass production. By the end of 1944, over 600,000 M3 SEERs had been built. The lines kept running day and night, 7 days a week. Some workers slept in the factory during snowstorms so the machines would never stop. The pay wasn't high, but the pride was priceless. Yet there were still problems. The first batches had small flaws, weak welds, sticky triggers, hide, and the engineers fixed them fast, replacing weak parts and improving the process. Every lesson made the gun stronger. The M3 was not perfect, but it was dependable. Soldiers didn't polish it, they trusted it. Outside the factory gates, freight trains waited to carry the guns east and west. Each crate held dozens of M3s wrapped in brown paper, their metal still warm from the line. They went to Europe, Africa, the Pacific, to places the workers could only imagine. One evening, as the whistle blew and the line stopped, a foreman looked at the day SEP's output, 1,080 guns. He smiled and said, "That's SEP's 1,080 chances for a man to live." The M3 had proven something powerful. America's greatest strength wasn't in gold or glory. It was in its workers, its machines, and its speed. The war was turning, and this small, cheap gun was now in the hands of men who needed it most. But the final judgment wouldn't come from factories or generals. It would come from the battlefields themselves, from mud, fire, and blood. Summer, 1944, France. The beaches of Normandy were still littered with wreckage and burnt tanks when the M3 grease gun met real war for the first time. The soldiers who carried it didn't care that it looked plain or that officers once laughed at it. What mattered was what happened when they pulled the trigger. Private Harold Jones from the 2nd Armored Division remembered the first time he used one. "I thought it looked like something from a garage," he said. "But when my Thompson jammed in the mud, this thing just kept going." That simple truth spread fast through the ranks. The M3 was ugly, cheap, and perfect for war. Tank crews loved it most. Inside cramped tanks, space was precious. The M3's folding wire stock made it small enough to fit under a seat or hang on a hook. When German infantry got close with grenades, tankers could open the hatch, unfold the stock, and fire bursts without even leaving the tank. It was light, quick, and dependable. The gun fired the same .45 ACP rounds as the Thompson, but at a slower rate of 450 rounds per minute. That made it easier to control. Fewer wasted bullets meant longer survival. The magazines were cheap to make and easy to load. Soldiers could fill one in under a minute. The sound it made, a slow, deep thump, became familiar across battlefields from Normandy to the Ardennes. In the jungles of the Pacific, the story was the same. The air was thick with heat, and mud stuck to everything. The M3's simple design saved lives. Private First Class Samuel Ortiz wrote home, "The Thompsons rust, the carbines jam, but this grease gun just spits lead all day." His letter became part of an army report praising the gun's exceptional reliability in adverse climates. The statistics backed it up. In field tests, the M3 showed less than 2 malfunctions per 1,000 rounds, a number almost unmatched by any other submachine gun of the time. For every 100 guns sent overseas, nearly every one worked perfectly right out of the crate. Even so, not everyone loved it. Some soldiers still missed the polished feel of the Thompson or the faster firing rate. They called the M3 clunky or cheap. But when bullets were flying, those complaints vanished. The grease gun's steel body took dents, but kept firing. It didn't mind rain, snow, or sand. As one lieutenant said, "You can run it over with a jeep, and it'll still work." During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when cold froze everything and soldiers fought in snow up to their knees, the M3 proved its worth again. Carbines jammed, rifles froze, but the M3, with its simple spring and solid bolt, kept firing. American soldiers joked that it worked better than the trucks that carried them. By 1945, over 700,000 B3s had been shipped overseas. Some were carried by paratroopers, others by engineers, medics, or truck drivers who needed something small but deadly. Many soldiers took them home after the war, calling them the best $20 Uncle Sam ever spent. Even enemy troops noticed. German soldiers who captured a M3C sometimes used them, impressed by how tough they were. One captured German note described it as crude but effective, better than it looks. For many soldiers, the M3 became a symbol of the American way of war. Fast, practical, reliable. It wasn't beautiful like the German MP40 or the British Sten, but it worked better under pressure. It proved that victory didn't always come from elegance. Sometimes it came from simple, stubborn usefulness. When the war ended, many M3Cs stayed in service. They were used again in Korea, and even in Vietnam decades later. Tank crews, pilots, and special forces All trusted the same design first built for $20 in Indiana. The gun that once made officers laugh had become one of the longest-serving weapons in U.S. military history. Its story wasn't about beauty. It was about endurance. But before the war ended, the M3 would face one last challenge, a crisis that almost stopped production and forced engineers to make it even better. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end. American troops were pushing into Germany, and victory finally seemed close. But back home in Indiana, at the guide lamp factory, a new problem appeared. The M3, the cheap and simple gun that had worked so well in battle, was starting to show signs of wear. After hundreds of thousands of guns built at high speed, inspectors began finding small issues, weak welds, cracked bolts, and broken cocking handles. In the rush to meet wartime demand, some machines had gone out of alignment, and a few parts weren't fitting as tightly as they should. Soldiers at the front were sending reports, the charging handle bends, or the trigger sticks in the cold. It wasn't a crisis of design. It was a crisis of mass production. When you make a million of anything, even small flaws can become big problems. But George Hyde and his team didn't panic. They had built the M3 to be simple, and that meant it could also be easily improved. The engineers met in the noisy plant office, surrounded by blueprints and coffee cups. "Let's make it better," Hyde said quietly, and they did. Their solution became the M3A1, an improved version that fixed the weak points. The new gun removed the fragile cocking handle and replaced it with a simple finger hole in the bolt. Soldiers could now pull it open without worrying about a part snapping off. The design also added a built-in magazine loading tool in the stock, small, clever, and practical. The oil bottle was now stored inside the pistol grip, saving space and reducing the chance of losing it. Everything about the M3A1 was a lesson learned from soldiers who had used it in real battle. It was a perfect example of how America's war machine listened, adapted, and evolved. By the end of World War II, the US had built nearly 700,000 M3s and M3A1s combined, saving the government millions of dollars compared to the Thompson. The money that would have gone into expensive guns was used for tanks, planes, and food for soldiers. One Army quartermaster joked, "We didn't win the war with money, we won it with machines that didn't waste any." The M3's journey didn't stop in 1945. It served again in Korea, where the freezing cold once more proved how well it worked in tough weather. Tank crews carried it into Vietnam, decades later, still calling it the grease gun. Even in the 1980s, American tank crews were still trained with it. Few weapons in history had such a long and loyal service. Many foreign armies used it too. The British received thousands under Lend-Lease. The French used it in Indochina. Even after newer designs like the M16 arrived, the old M3A1 stayed around, quiet, reliable, and tough. What began as a desperate wartime experiment had become a global symbol of American practicality. The M3's legacy wasn't built on beauty or glory, it was built on purpose. One retired soldier summed it up years later. "It wasn't set pretty, it wasn't set fancy, but it never quit. That sets all a man ever asks of his weapon." The M3 proved a simple truth. Strength doesn't always come from perfection. Sometimes it comes from simplicity, honesty, and the courage to change old ways. George Hyde didn't live to see just how famous his little gun became, but his work shaped the future of American small arms. Later weapons, the MS-16, the M4, and many others, all carried lessons learned from his $20 gun. When historians look back, they see more than just a submachine gun. They see a turning point. The moment America realized that innovation wasn't only about invention, but about production. The power to build fast, cheap, and smart was the real secret weapon. They had started with an impossible order: make a gun as good as the Thompson for 1/10 the cost. They ended with a design that lasted more than 40 years. They had come as perfectionists. They left as pragmatists. They had come to build a gun. They built a legend. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its battleships. It was its ability to adapt, to turn steel and sweat into something greater. The M3 grease gun may have been born from necessity, but it became a symbol of ingenuity, resilience, and victory.